Through the bitter Montana winter, three desperate outlaws pushed their exhausted horses to the limit. The freezing wind carried whispers of their infamy, the Blackwood brothers, whose string of train robberies had left a trail of empty safes and dead lawmen across 4 territories. Behind them, telegraph wires hummed with warnings, and ahead lay the vast expanse of the Bitterroot Valley, where survival meant finding fresh mounts before their horses collapsed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What drove them wasn't just the howling wind or the approaching storm, but the knowledge that every lawman and bounty hunter west of the Mississippi now carried their description. The $5,000 reward on each of their heads had turned former friends into potential betrayers. Their only chance lay in reaching the Canadian border, but their horses, stolen 3 days ago from a livery stable in Helena, were failing fast. What these hardened outlaws couldn't know was that their next decision would bring them face to face with Nathan Hawk, the legendary Army scout turned rancher, whose name was still whispered around campfires from Texas to Montana. A man who'd earned his reputation during the Apache Wars, where his rifle had never missed a target at distances other men considered impossible. They were about to learn why old-timers said Hawk could shoot the wings off a butterfly at 300 yards, and why he'd spent the last 5 years trying to forget the lives his skill had claimed. The story that follows isn't just about stolen horses or frontier justice. It's about how 3 desperate men discovered that some skills can't be buried, and some reputations are earned in blood. Dawn painted the Bitterroot Valley in shades of pristine white, the fresh snow untouched, except for the tracks Nathan Hawk followed along his fence line. At 58, he moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, each step deliberate as his eyes read the story written in the snow. His prized mare, Shadow, walked beside him without a lead rope, her black coat a stark contrast against the white landscape. The horse had been with him through 5 years of peace, more partner than possession. The ranch was modest by Montana standards, 800 acres nestled against the mountains, with a sturdy cabin, 2 barns, and the finest horse barn in 3 counties. To passing travelers, it looked like any other small spread, just another homesteader trying to carve out a life in the harsh Montana territory. They didn't notice how the buildings were positioned to cover every approach, or how the corrals were built with reinforced gates that could withstand a battering ram. Hawk paused at the north corner, kneeling to examine fresh tracks in the snow. "What do you make of these, girl?" he murmured to Shadow. The mare's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring at some distant scent. Horse thieves had been growing bold lately, targeting isolated ranches in the valley. Most folks figured Nathan Hawk for an easy mark, a quiet man living alone with some of the finest horseflesh in the territory. Sarah Cooper, who ran the telegraph office in Hamilton, had warned him just yesterday. "They're working their way through the valley, Mr. Hawk. Maybe think about hiring some hands." She was kind, worried about a seemingly vulnerable neighbor. Like most people in the Bitterroot, she didn't know about the specially modified Winchester hidden in a secret compartment by his bed, or the reputation that made old Indian fighters cross themselves when they heard his name. Shadow suddenly tensed, head high, staring toward the distant tree line. Hawk followed the mare's gaze, his hand unconsciously moving to where his rifle would have rested in the old days. The morning was too quiet. No birds, no distant sounds of his other horses. Something was wrong. The cabin door opened, and Mary Blackfeather, his housekeeper of 3 years, stepped out onto the porch. She was the only person in the valley who knew his full story, who understood why he spent hours maintaining his shooting skills in the hidden range behind his property. "Breakfast is ready," she called, but her tone carried a warning. They had company. Two riders were approaching from the main road, snow kicking up behind their horses. From their bearing and the badges glinting in the winter sun, Hawk knew they were lawmen before he could make out their faces. Shadow nickered softly, picking up on her master's tension. 5 years of peace, Hawk thought. 5 years of trying to forget the weight of a rifle in his hands, the look in a man's eyes when he realized he'd been shot from an impossible distance. 5 years of being just another rancher, trying to outrun a reputation written in notches on his old army rifle. But as he watched the lawmen approach, Nathan Hawk knew his past was about to catch up with him. In this country, a man's reputation was like the mountain winters. It might seem distant during the warm seasons, but it always returned with a vengeance. Marshal Tom Reeves and Deputy Will Carson dismounted at Hawk's gate, their horses shying away from Shadow's imposing presence. The marshal's face was grim, his weathered features bearing news he didn't want to deliver. Hawk recognized that look. He'd seen it too many times during the Apache Wars. Hawk, Reeves nodded, hand consciously away from his gun. Even after 5 years, lawmen still approached Nathan with caution. Got trouble brewing. Blackwood brothers broke out of Montana Territorial Prison last night, Hawk said quietly. Not a question. Shadow shifted behind him, sensing the change in her master's demeanor. How'd you... The deputy started, but Reeves silenced him with a look. I was there when they were sentenced, Hawk explained, memories stirring like snow in a winter storm. 2 years ago, Helena. Strange thing about that trial. Never did find all the gold from their last robbery. Mary appeared with coffee, her movements deliberate as she set the tray on the porch rail. The deputy's eyes widened slightly as she pulled back her shawl, revealing an intricate beaded medallion that marked her as a tribal medicine woman. Few knew that Mary Blackfeather had been one of the most respected scouts in the territory before choosing a quieter life. You're that Hawk? Deputy Carson breathed, recognition finally dawning. Hawkeye Hawk, the one they wrote about in the papers? Those stories get more dramatic with each telling, Hawk cut him off, but the deputy continued, starstruck. They say you could shoot the flame off a candle at 200 yards without touching the wick. That you once took out 5 Apache warriors with 5 shots at ranges that shouldn't have been possible. 7, Mary corrected quietly, and he gave them every chance to withdraw. Hawk's hand unconsciously touched his left shoulder, where an arrowhead from that day still rested too deep to remove. That had been his last engagement before hanging up his rifle, before seeking the peace of this valley. The Blackwoods are headed this way, Reeves continued, watching Hawk carefully. Word is, they're looking for fresh horses. They've already killed 2 guards, won't hesitate to kill again. That's not all, Mary added, her voice carrying years of tribal wisdom. Tell him the rest, Tom. Reeves shifted uncomfortably. Their youngest brother, Michael Blackwood, he was there at your last scouting mission, one of the young warriors you had to... The morning suddenly felt colder. Hawk remembered the young brave, barely more than a boy, who'd refused to stand down that day. He'd tried to walk away from that life, from the violence that had defined him, but sometimes the past didn't give you that choice. 5 years ago, Hawk said quietly, I buried my rifle and my commission, swore I was done with killing, built something peaceful here. His eyes drifted to his prized horses in the distant pasture, especially the young colts he'd been training, each one worth a small fortune to the right buyer, or to desperate men needing fast mounts. I remember, Reeves nodded. You told me why. After 38 confirmed kills. 42, Hawk corrected. The army only counted the ones with witnesses. Shadow pressed her nose against his shoulder, a gesture of comfort. The mare had been with him through the transition from feared scout to peaceful rancher, and seemed to understand the weight of this moment. We're alerting all the ranchers, Reeves concluded. doubled the patrols, but if they're hell-bent on revenge, they won't come straight at me, Hawk said, years of experience speaking. Men like that, driven by hate and fear, they'll try to hurt me first. Take something I care about. His eyes drifted to his horses, and a chill ran down his spine. Some reputations were built on skill, others on luck, but Nathan Hawke's legend had been built on an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and men's intentions, to know where and how they would strike before they did. Mary and Reeves exchanged glances. They knew that look. It was the same one he'd worn during his last mission, when he'd known the killing was about to start. Midnight found James Blackwood and his brothers huddled in a shallow cave, their prison clothes caked with snow and sweat. 3 days of running had left them exhausted, the howl of pursuit dogs still echoing in their nightmares. Their stolen horses had gone lame 5 miles back, forcing them to continue on foot. "We ain't going to make it to Canada like this," Richard, the youngest, whispered. His hands shook as he checked their remaining ammunition, 4 rounds between them. James studied the valley below through a stolen spyglass. A small ranch lay nestled against the foothills, its buildings dark, except for a single lamp burning. In an upstairs window, more importantly, several magnificent horses stood in the corrals, their coats gleaming under the moonlight. "That's our ticket out," James nodded toward the horses. "1 good mount each could carry us to the border." Daniel, the middle brother, shifted nervously. "Looks like a settler's spread, but see how the buildings are positioned? Man's careful." "About his sight lines. Careful doesn't mean dangerous," James sneered. "One old rancher living alone with prize horseflesh. Probably some rich Easterner playing cowboy. Besides, we ain't asking to buy." They waited another hour, watching the last light go out. The wind carried the distant baying of hounds. The prison pursuit was getting closer. It was now or never. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James led them down the slope, keeping to the shadows. A black mare raised her head as they approached, but made no sound. Smart horse, James thought, worth more than just transportation. Richard worked the corral gate while Daniel stood watch. The mare backed away, showing more intelligence than typical ranch stock. A sugar cube appeared in Daniel's hand, lifted from the prison kitchen days ago, saved for just such a need. "Easy, big fellow," he coaxed. "Just need to borrow your speed for a while." The mare's ears flicked forward, nostrils testing the air. For a moment James thought she would bolt, but then she stepped forward, elegant and proud, her muscles rippling with barely contained power as she accepted the treat. "Throw the saddle on," James ordered. "Quick and quiet." Daniel found tack hanging in the corral shed. The mare accepted the saddle without protest, but something about her calm demeanor made the hair on James's neck stand up. This was no ordinary ranch horse. "Someone's coming," Richard hissed. Lantern light had appeared in the house's lower window. James didn't hesitate. He swung into the saddle, reaching down to pull Richard up behind him. Daniel barely managed to grab the mare's trailing lead rope as James spurred her into motion. The horse's power was incredible. She cleared the corral fence in a single bound, hooves barely touching ground before launching into a full gallop. Behind them, a door slammed open. A man's voice cut through the night. "Shadow, break!" But the mare was already running, carrying her stolen burden into the darkness. The last thing James heard was the distinctive sound of a rifle being worked. "He won't shoot," James assured his brothers as they thundered away. "Not with his precious horse between us and him." They rode hard for an hour, putting miles between themselves and the ranch. Only then did Richard speak, his voice shaking. "James, that voice back there, did it sound familiar to you?" "Just some rancher," James dismissed it, but a cold feeling was growing in his gut. Something about that commanding tone, the way the horse had been so well trained. "James," Daniel said quietly, what if we just stole from someone we shouldn't have? But it was too late for second thoughts. They had their escape mounts, and come morning, they'd be halfway to Canada. One old rancher, no matter who he was, couldn't change that. They were wrong. Nathan. Hawk stood in the empty corral, reading the story written in the trampled snow. Mary watched from the porch, his old army Winchester cradled in her arms as he knelt to examine the tracks. 5 years of peace fell away like winter frost as he processed the scene with cold precision. 3 men, he said quietly, fingers tracing. The indentations. Prison-issue boots, all of them. The heaviest one, probably James Blackwood, favors his right leg, an old wound from the Helena robbery. He lifted a few crystals of snow, letting them melt between his fingers. Been on foot at least a day, desperate enough to risk open ground. You could let the law handle this, Mary suggested, but her tone said she already knew the answer. She'd seen that look in his eyes before, during the Apache Wars, when he'd switched from scout to hunter. Hawk moved to the corral gate, noting the careful way it had been opened. They're professionals, knew enough to oil the hinges first. His eyes narrowed at a small white crystal in the snow. Sugar cube from the prison kitchen. They planned this. He straightened, eyes scanning the horizon. The moon was setting, but he had maybe 4 hours until dawn. Shadow's tracks led north, toward the Canadian border. Smart, but predictable. Without a word, Hawk walked to the cabin. Mary followed him inside, watching as he knelt by the stone hearth and pried up a loose flagstone. The oiled leather rifle case lay exactly as it had for 5 years, wrapped around a custom-modified Winchester Model 1876 with a specially crafted scope. "Are you sure about this?" Mary asked. "Those boys, they're killers." "They're also scared," Hawk said quietly, unwrapping the rifle slowly, reverently. "Running hard, don't know who they've stolen from." He checked the action, still smooth as silk. He'd cleaned it every Sunday, a habit he couldn't break. That makes them dangerous. More dangerous than that last Apache band. Hawk strapped on his old cartridge belt, each motion fluid despite the years. The weight felt familiar, like greeting an old friend, or maybe an old demon. "The Apache knew who I was," he said, moving to a trunk in the corner. Knew what? They were walking into. "These boys," he pulled out a deerskin jacket, the leather weathered and supple. "They think they stole from some peaceful rancher." Mary watched him transform. Each item he retrieved, the special moccasins designed for silent movement, the low-crowned hat with its distinctive braided band, the custom ammunition pouches, seemed to strip away another layer of the peaceful farmer, revealing the legendary scout beneath. "Marshal Reeves will have possession by dawn," she said. "They'll be looking for 3 prisoners heading north." "Shadow's smart," Hawk replied, checking his spare ammunition. "She'll lead them west first, toward Bear Creek. They won't know she's trained to do that." His hands moved to the rifle's scope, adjusting it with practiced precision. "And you?" "I'll be waiting at Split Rock Pass, where Shadow knows to go if she's ever stolen." He strapped on his old army spurs, not the plain working ones he'd used for ranching, but distinctive ones with a unique jingle that had once made his footsteps instantly recognizable to friend and foe alike. Mary nodded slowly. "I'll have coffee ready when you return." "Mary," he paused at the door, "if I don't make it back, you'll make it back," she cut him off. "You're Nathan Hawk, but more importantly, you're not hunting them. You're just going to get your horse." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That's right, just getting my horse." But they both knew that once Nathan Hawk picked up his rifle, things rarely ended peacefully. He stepped out into the night, his moccasins silent on the snow. High above, the northern lights danced across the sky in shades of green and purple. In the old days, the Blackfeet used to say that when Death's shadow walked, the spirit lights came to watch. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Marshal Reeves found Hawk at the crossroads, already mounted on his spare horse. The old lawman barely recognized him. Gone was the peaceful rancher. In his place sat a figure from 100 army dispatches and frontier legends. The deerskin jacket seemed to absorb the pre-dawn light, and the scoped rifle gleamed with deadly promise. "Thought I might find you here," Reeves said, reining his horse to a stop. "Got 3 posses forming up in Hamilton. Could use a man with your tracking skills." "You know I can't do that, Tom." Hawk's voice was different too, harder, carrying the weight of his past. "Official pursuit means rules, procedures. Those boys have my horse, and if they figure out who's after them, they'll make mistakes. Fear does that to men." Reeves shifted in his saddle. "There's something else you should know. Got a wire from Fort Benton. Seems the Blackwoods had help breaking out. Someone with money hiring professionals. This isn't just about escape anymore." Hawk checked his rifle's action, his movements deliberate. "Revenge, then, for their brother at the last Apache raid." Reeves hesitated. "These boys, they've got friends. Bad ones. Word is, remnants of Red Jack's gang are backing them, waiting up north to help them cross into Canada." A cold smile touched Hawk's lips. "Good. Saves me the trouble of hunting them down later." "You're not thirsty anymore," Reeves pressed. "Let the law handle this. Like the law handled Red Jack's gang." Hawk turned in his saddle, and Reeves fought the urge to back away. 7 dead settlers, 3 burned homesteads before they called me in. As if to emphasize his point, a rifle shot cracked across the valley. The bullet kicked up snow near Hawk's horse, but neither he nor his mount flinched. "Looks like the reception party's here early," Hawk said calmly, lifting his rifle in one fluid motion. "You might want to clear out, Tom. What's about to happen isn't official business." 3 riders emerged from the tree line, rifles raised. Not the Blackwoods. These men were professionals, hired guns, positioned to slow down any pursuit. "Last chance, Hawk," one called out. "Ride back to your ranch. This doesn't have to get messy." Hawk's response was a blur of motion. Through his scope, the lead man's rifle sight appeared like a silver dollar at 20 paces. His first shot shattered it, the second took the shooter's hat off, and the third wounded his horse, all in less than 3 seconds, at a range other men would consider impossible. "That was me being nice," Hawk called out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Next 3 shots go about 2 feet higher. Your choice." The riders wheeled their horses and fled, leaving their companions' wounded mount behind. Hawk lowered his rifle with the same fluid grace. 5 years, Reeves whispered, "and you haven't lost a step." "Like riding a horse," Hawk replied grimly, "or ending men's lives. Some skills you never forget." He turned his horse west. "Tell Mary I'll be back when Shadow is." Reeves watched him ride away, the deerskin jacket melting into the pre-dawn. Shadows. He remembered what old scouts used to say, "Death's shadow doesn't chase you, he just finds where your trial ends." The sun climbed higher as Hawk followed Shadow's tracks, each hoofprint telling a story. The mare was playing her part perfectly, leading the Blackwoods west instead of north, just as she'd been trained. But something about the tracks troubled him. They were too obvious, too easy to follow. He dismounted at a stream crossing, kneeling, to examine marks in the mud. Shadow had stopped here, probably refusing to cross immediately. Hawk could almost see the scene. James Blackwood growing frustrated, maybe using spurs. His hand tightened on his rifle at the thought, getting soft. "Hawky," a voice whispered in his mind. It sounded like the old army captain who'd first recognized his gift with a rifle. "Time was. You'd have put them in the ground already." Hawk pushed the voice away, but his hands were shaking slightly as he checked his scope. 5 years of peace had changed him more than he'd realized. The weight of the rifle, once as natural as breathing, now felt heavy with memory and regret. A twig snapped in the brush. Hawk's rifle seemed to aim itself, muscle memory faster than thought. A young Blackfeet boy emerged, maybe 14, leading a painted pony. He froze at the sight of Hawk, eyes wide with recognition. "You're him," the boy whispered. "Long shot." The one grandfather speaks of. He says you could shoot the wings off an eagle without killing it. Hawk lowered his rifle slowly, disturbed by how easily the killing instincts had returned. Those stories are old, son. Just looking for a stolen horse now. The black mare, one with the white star? The boy nodded eagerly. Saw 3 Wasikyu, white men, on her about 2 hours back. Father said to stay away, said they looked like bad medicine. Your father's right, Hawk said. Get on home now. Things might get dangerous around here. Are you going to kill them, Mr. Hawk? Like the stories say you did to the renegades who were raiding our villages? The question hit him like a physical blow. Was that all he'd become? A story to frighten children with? No, son, just want my horse back. But as he rode on, Hawk couldn't shake the familiar emptiness growing inside him, the cold, calculating part that had made him so feared. During the wars, the trail led to Bear Creek Canyon, where the walls rose steep and narrow, perfect ambush territory. 5 years ago, he'd have gone in shooting, trusting in skill and instinct. Now, a rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls. Hawk's horse reared as a bullet kicked up stone splinters nearby. 2 riders appeared on the rim above, more hired guns, not the Blackwoods. That's close enough, Hawk, one shouted. Walk away from this. Hawk assessed the situation with professional detachment. 2 shooters above, probably more hidden. They had position, firepower, and the high ground. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd given away their positions by talking. His first shot caught the speaker's rifle, splitting the stock in 2. The second hit a rock 6 inches from the other man's head. A warning that the third would be lower. Both men ducked behind cover. That's 2 rounds, Hawk called out, his voice carrying the authority of countless engagements. I've got 8 left. Next ones won't be warnings. Silence answered him. They were professionals. They'd heard the stories, knew his reputation for never missing at any range. Walk away, he offered. Tell your employers that Death's shadow is on their trail. The sound of retreating horses told him they'd chosen wisely, but the encounter left him shaken. Not by the danger, that had been almost routine. No, what disturbed him was how easily he'd slipped back into the role, how natural it felt. Just getting my horse, he reminded himself. But the cold voice in his head laughed. They both knew better. The legend of Longshot Hawk was awake again, and it would demand its due in blood. U.S. Marshal Daniel Green stood in Hawk's empty cabin, examining the old Army commendations spread across the kitchen table. Mary watched him carefully, noting how his eyes lingered on the oldest one, a citation for extraordinary valor during the Apache Wars, signed by General Crook himself. Interesting reading material, Green commented. Nathan keeps them as reminders, Mary replied, of what he was, what he chose not to be anymore. The Marshal picked up a newer document, the Blackwood brothers' prison records. And now these 3 force him back into it. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Meaning this whole prison break stinks of setup, professional help. On the inside, hired guns waiting with fresh horses, and now they just happen to steal the prize mount of the one man who might be able to stop them. He shook his head. Someone's playing a deeper game. A rider approached outside. Sheriff. Reeves coming in fast. He burst through the door, face grim. Got trouble, he announced. Wire from Fort Benton. The remnants of Red Jack's gang aren't just waiting to help the Blackwoods cross the border. They're moving south, at least 30 strong. Green cursed softly. They're using the Blackwoods as bait, drawing Hawk out. That's not all, Reeves continued. Remember Michael Blackwood, the one Hawk had to shoot during that last Apache raid. Turns out he had an uncle, Colonel Marcus Blackwood, former Army commander turned railroad baron. Man's been pulling strings, calling in favors, spending. A fortune to set this up. Mary's face paled. A colonel with resources and a grudge. That explains the professional help. Hawk's walking into a trap, Green said. Those boys took his horse to wound his pride, make him follow. They're leading him straight to an army of killers looking for revenge. Then we'd better warn him. Reeves reached for his hat. No! Green's voice carried the full authority of his office. This is now a federal matter. I'm declaring the Blackwoods under U.S. Marshal protection. Protection? Mary's voice was incredulous. They're escaped killers. Who might testify against a corrupt colonel if we can take them alive? I'm ordering Hawk to stand down. Mary laughed. A cold, knowing sound. Order all you want, Marshal, but you don't know Nathan like I do. Those boys took Shadow. That makes this personal. Then I'll stop him myself. Green patted his gun. Badge or no badge, he has to obey the law. Like the law stopped Red Jack's gang? Mary's eyes were steel. There's a reason they called Nathan in to handle that. Some men are beyond normal law. No one's beyond the law, Mrs. Blackfeather. Maybe not. She nodded toward the army commendations. But some men are the law's last resort. Its final answer when nothing else works. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively. Somewhere out there, Nathan Hawk was riding toward a trap, while behind him, the law was mobilizing to stop him from falling into it. God help anyone who gets in his way, Reeves muttered, and no one in the room could disagree. The homestead was still smoldering when Hawk rode up, 3 hours behind the Blackwoods. The ashes told their story with brutal clarity. Of families, dreams reduced to charred timber and smoke. Shadow's tracks led straight through the yard, but something about their pattern made Hawk's blood run cold. An elderly man sat on his overturned wagon, a blood-stained bandage around his arm. His wife worked silently beside him, salvaging what little remained of their life. Their young grandson clutched a lifeless border collie, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on his face. Hawk, the old man nodded, recognizing him. Figured you'd be alone eventually, following their trail. Nathan dismounted, studying the scene. The snow held a story those who hadn't spent years reading sign would miss. Shadow had fought here, hard. The deep gouges in the frozen ground showed. She'd nearly unseated her riders twice. They did this. His voice carried a deadly quiet. The truth had been more complex. Colonel Blackwood had been selling army rifles to raiders, using his nephew's patrols as cover. When Hawk's scouting revealed the scheme, the colonel faced court-martial. Michael, young and loyal to family over. Honor chose the wrong side. Now history was repeating itself, but with higher stakes. This time the colonel had gathered every gunman and disgraced soldier with a grudge against army scouts, against the law, against Hawk himself. The crack of a rifle brought him back to the present. The bullet whined overhead, not even close, a warning shot. 2 riders emerged from the trees ahead, blocking his path. Their horses bore army brands, but their gear was pure outlaw. "That's far enough, Longshot," the first called out. His voice carried the clipped tones of formal military training. "Colonel's compliments, but this trail ends here." Hawk studied them through his scope. Ex-cavalry by their bearing, probably from the colonel's old command. Good riders, decent shots, but they held their reins wrong for a quick draw. "Been a while since I took orders from army men," Hawk replied calmly. "Especially ones riding with outlaws." Times change. Colonel Blackwood remembers who served him loyal. Pays better than a scout's wages, too. Last loyal man who served him died at Broken Skull Pass. Hawk's voice carried across the snow. His own nephew. How's that weighing on your conscience? "Lieutenant Harrison," the rider stiffened. "How did you always did wear your spurs backwards. Bad habit for a cavalry officer." Both men's hands dropped to their guns, but Hawk's first shot had already split the air. It caught Harrison's horse's bridle, spooking the animal into rearing. The second shot took his partner's hat off. By the time they recovered, Hawk had vanished into the swirling snow. "Ghost rider," he heard one mutter. "Like the Indians said, death's shadow walks in winter." Hawk pushed on through the storm, the cold settling into his bones. Every instinct honed by years of scouting told him he was being watched, herded toward. A carefully planned trap. But he had no choice. Shadow's tracks were getting harder to follow, and the mare would be tiring. She couldn't fight her riders forever. Near dusk, he found the remains of their camp, still warm. They'd stayed longer than they should have, probably arguing about their next move. The signs told him Shadow had refused to eat or drink following her training. Smart girl. A piece of paper had been deliberately left by the fire, weighted down. With a stone, Hawk approached carefully, checking for traps before retrieving it. The handwriting was elegant, educated, Colonel Blackwood's distinctive style. Scout Hawk. Did you think I wouldn't learn the truth? That I wouldn't discover it was your report that ruined me? 5 years I've planned this, waiting for the perfect moment. Now you'll learn what it means to lose everything you've built. Your reputation for mercy is your weakness. You'll follow my men because they have your precious horse, and you'll try to take them alive. That nobility will be your undoing. 30 of my best men await you at Broken Skull Pass. Each has a personal reason to want you dead. Come dawn, we'll finish what started 5 years ago. Or you could ride away. Live with the knowledge that you chose your life over your principles, over the animal you claim to care for. Choose wisely, Scout. Your legend ends either way. Colonel Marcus Blackwood, formerly of the 7th Cavalry. Hawk read the letter twice, then fed it to the dying fire. The colonel was right about one thing. Dawn would settle accounts. But he was wrong about mercy being a weakness. Sometimes mercy was knowing exactly when to stop being merciful. As darkness fell, Hawk made camp in a sheltered ravine, his fire no larger than a candle flame. The storm had intensified, but it worked to his advantage. The heavy snow would force the Blackwoods to hole up for the night, giving Shadow time to wear them down. He pulled out his old scout's journal, its pages weathered by years of service. Inside, detailed maps of Broken Skull Pass showed every approach, every potential sniper's nest. He'd drawn them after the last confrontation, never expecting to need them again. But some part of him had known this day would come. The sound of approaching hooves brought him alert. 2 riders materialized from the storm, Mary Blackfeather and a young army lieutenant in a spotless uniform. Found him exactly where you said, ma'am, the lieutenant called out, helping Mary dismount. Nathan, she nodded, settling by his fire. Lieutenant James Carter here brought news you need to hear. The young officer shifted uncomfortably under Hawk's gaze. Sir, I serve under Colonel Reynolds at Fort Benton. We've been investigating Colonel Blackwood for months. What happened 5 years ago? It wasn't just about selling rifles to raiders. Hawk's eyes narrowed. Explain. The colonel was part of a larger conspiracy. Several high-ranking officers were selling more than just rifles. They were selling patrol schedules, fort layouts, troop movements. When your scouting report exposed the rifle scheme, Blackwood had to be sacrificed to protect the others. And now they're all involved in this trap, Mary added. The colonel's gathered every corrupt officer and soldier who might be exposed if he talks. They're not just coming for revenge, Nathan. They're coming to bury their secrets. How many? More than 30 now, Carter reported. 2 full troops of cavalry gone bad, plus Red Jack's gang. They've got the pass surrounded, Gatling guns on both ridges, sharpshooters in the rocks. So it's suicide to go in alone. Hawk studied his maps again. You're assuming I'm going to ride straight into their trap. A ghost of a smile touched Mary's lips. You have another plan? Colonel thinks he knows me. I think 5 years of peace made me soft. Hawk's finger traced a faint line on his map. He forgot who taught him mountain warfare in the first place. Carter leaned forward. Sir, there's an old Blackfeet hunting trail. Comes down behind the pass. Need a skilled climber to reach it, especially in this weather. He looked at Mary. That's why you brought him? She nodded. Lieutenant Carter commands the best wilderness troops at the fort. 20 men, all volunteers, ready to move on your word. The colonel has 3 times that many. The colonel's men are fighting for money, Carter said quietly. My men are fighting for honor. We've watched good soldiers die to protect these. Conspirators' secrets. Time that ended. Hawk studied the young officer. There was steel there, reminiscent of Michael Blackwood before corruption claimed him. "Your men understand the risk? Following a disgraced scout against superior forces?" "Sir, with respect, you're not disgraced. Every honest soldier knows you sacrificed your career to expose corruption. We've waited 5 years for a chance to finish what you started." Mary produced a sealed document. Colonel Reynolds signed, "This an hour ago. Full reinstatement to Army Scout status, with authority to command troops in the field. Your record's been cleared, Nathan. Time to finish this, the right way." Hawk stared at the document for a long moment. "Not for revenge. For justice," Carter said firmly, "and to show corrupt men that some legends don't die, they just wait for the right moment." "How long does it take to get your men in position?" 4 hours. "We'll come down that trail like mountain lions, silent until we strike." Hawk rolled up his maps. "I'll keep them focused on me. When you hear my rifle, you'll know it's time." "The storm works in our favor," Mary observed. "Dark moon tonight. Perfect hunting weather." As they prepared to leave, Carter hesitated. "Sir, what about your horse, Shadow?" A cold smile touched Hawk's lips. "By dawn, she'll have done her part. I trained her well." After they'd gone, Hawk opened his rifle case again. Inside lay something he hadn't looked at in 5 years. His old Scout's Medal, awarded for valor above and beyond the call of duty. He pinned it to his jacket, its weight familiar and right. The storm howled around him, but Hawk felt a strange peace. Tomorrow would bring blood and judgment, an end to 5 years of waiting. The colonel thought he was springing a trap, but he'd forgotten the first rule of hunting. The most dangerous predator isn't the one that charges straight in. It's the one that circles back to strike from behind. Midnight painted the mountains in shades of silver and shadow as James Blackwood struggled to control Shadow. The mare had fought them every step, nearly throwing Richard twice in the last hour. Now, in a narrow canyon just south of their rendezvous point, she refused to move another step. "Cursed horse," James snarled, yanking the reins. Shadow's only response was to plant her hooves more firmly in the frozen ground, her ears flat against her head. "Maybe we should rest," Daniel suggested, checking their dwindling supplies. "Storm's getting worse, and we rest when we reach the colonel's." "Men," James snapped. He drew his pistol, pressing it against Shadow's head. "Move, you stubborn!" The mare's reaction was explosive. She reared suddenly, twisting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. James found himself flying through the air, landing hard. In a snowbank, the gun disappeared into the darkness. "Told you we should have taken the brown horse," Richard muttered, helping his brother up. "This one's too smart, like she's been trained for—" A whistle cut through the storm. 3 sharp notes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Shadow's head snapped up, ears forward. "No," James breathed, recognition dawning too late. "Don't let her—" The mare bolted, not north toward their pursuers or south toward escape, but east, straight up what looked like an impassable slope. Her hooves found hidden paths in the rock with impossible precision, and in moments she vanished into the swirling snow. "She'll die up there," Daniel said, but his voice carried no conviction. "She won't." The voice that answered seemed to emanate from the storm itself. "I trained her to find that trail, just like I trained her to fight anyone who stole her, just like I trained her to come home." The brothers drew their remaining weapons, backing into a defensive circle. But there was nothing to shoot at, only shadows and swirling snow. "Show yourself," James shouted, his voice carrying an edge of panic. "Why?" Hawk's voice drifted down like ice. "So you can miss? Waste what little ammunition you have left?" A shot rang out. Richard fired blindly into the darkness, the sound echoing off canyon walls. When the echoes died, only the storm's howl remained. "1 bullet left," Hawk commented. "Your brother's gun is empty, James. Has been since that family you terrorized. Daniel's got 2 shells in his shotgun. Not very professional, letting yourselves run low." The brothers exchanged shocked glances. He'd been closer than they'd thought. Watching them, the colonel's waiting, James called out, trying to sound confident. 30 men with orders to kill you on sight. You really want to die for a horse? Interesting choice of words. A shadow detached itself from the rocks above them. The brothers raised their weapons, but Hawk had already vanished again. Tell me about the colonel, about why he broke you out of prison. You know why, James spat. Revenge for his nephew. No. Hawk's voice came from a different direction. Michael's death was just an excuse. The colonel needs something worth spending a fortune to arrange this trap, something worth burning his last favors with corrupt officers. Richard's nerve broke. The ledger! He wants the ledger you took from Michael. Richard, shut up, James hissed. But Hawk had gone silent, and somehow that was worse than his voice in the darkness. The brothers could almost feel him processing this new information, pieces falling into place. Of course, Hawk said finally. Michael wasn't just riding with raiders. He was carrying proof of his uncle's bigger operation. Names, dates, amounts, everything that would expose not just the colonel, but every officer and politician who helped him. A bitter laugh echoed through the canyon. 5 years I've kept that evidence, wondering if I should have turned it over. Let the army clean its own house. Now the colonel's gathered all his conspirators in one place, thinking they're here for revenge. You're surrounded, James tried one last time. The pass is blocked. Every escape route is covered. You can't win. I already have. There was something terrifying in how calm Hawk sounded. The colonel just gathered every corrupt officer in the territory exactly where I needed them. And you three, you're going to help me finish this. Like hell we will. You don't have a choice. Your guns are nearly empty. Your horse is gone. The storm's getting worse, and you're standing in the middle of a kill zone I've used before. But I'm offering you the same choice I gave your friend. Michael, surrender to proper authorities, testify about the colonel's operation, live to see another dawn. And if we refuse? A rifle shot cracked through the darkness. The bullet knocked James's remaining gun from his hand with surgical precision. A second shot split Richard's gun belt, dropping it into the snow. The third shot took Daniel's shotgun apart at the breech. That's not really an option, Hawk said quietly. For a moment, only the storm's voice filled the canyon. Then Daniel stepped forward, hands raised. He's right, James. Michael died protecting the colonel's secrets. I'm not dying for them too. Richard followed suit. We never signed up for this. Breaking out was one thing, but this conspiracy. James looked at his empty hands, then at the darkness surrounding them. The colonel will kill us if we talk. The colonel won't survive till noon. Hawk's voice carried absolute certainty. Army scouts are moving into position as we speak. Honest soldiers who've waited 5 years to clean this corruption from their ranks. By dawn, every man who followed Colonel Blackwood's orders will face justice. From the shadows, Mary Blackfeather emerged, rifle ready. Behind her, Lieutenant Carter and 2 of his men materialized like spirits. Your choice, James, Hawk said one final time, but choose quickly. We have work to do before dawn. In the distance, Shadow's distinctive whinny drifted down from the heights. She had found the secret trail, just as she'd been trained. Now she was calling others to follow. James Blackwood looked up into the swirling snow, then at his brothers. 5 years in prison had taught him when a fight was lost. All right, he sighed. What do you want to know? Everything, Hawk replied, finally stepping into view. Starting with exactly how many men the colonel has, where they're positioned, and what orders they're following. Then we'll discuss the real reason he wanted that ledger so badly. As James began talking, more figures emerged from the storm. Army scouts in winter gear, moving like shadows through the night. The trap, meant for one man, was about to become a snare for those who set it. High above, Shadow watched from her vantage point, steam rising from her flanks. The mare's part in this dance was done. Now it was time for her master to finish what had started 5 years ago, when a young lieutenant's death set in motion events that would finally expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest ranks of the army itself. The colonels got the past divided into 3 sections, James explained, drawing a rough map in the snow with a stick. 20 men on the north ridge with 2 Gatling guns, another 15 on the south approach, including Red Jack's old gang. The rest are mobile reserves, ready to respond wherever you appear. Lieutenant Carter studied the crude diagram. Heavy coverage on both high grounds. They're expecting a frontal assault. Because that's what the colonel remembers of me, Hawk said quietly. Direct approach, impossible shots, overwhelming force. He's fighting a legend that's 5 years old. There's more, Daniel added, stepping forward. The colonel's got a personal guard, 10 men, all ex-cavalry officers who served with him. They're not just fighting for money, they're true believers. Think the army betrayed him. Mary's eyes narrowed. How many of them were part of his original conspiracy? All of them, Richard answered. That's why they're so loyal. If the colonel falls, they fall with him. Hawk absorbed this information, his mind working through implications. The ledger would implicate them all. No wonder they're willing to die to protect him. A scout materialized from the darkness. Sir, movement on the north ridge. They're setting up signal fires, getting ready for dawn. They'll expect us to wait for light, Carter said. Better visibility for shooting. Then we move now. Hawk turned to his assembled force. Lieutenant, take your men up the hunting trail. Mary, guide them. When you reach the overlook, wait for my signal. What about us? James asked, indicating himself and his brothers. You're coming with me. The colonel needs to see you alive, or he'll know something's wrong. You're using us as bait, Daniel realized. No. Hawk's voice carried a cold certainty. I'm giving you a chance to set things right, to end this without more bloodshed. A sudden gust of wind carried a new sound, horses approaching from the south. Many horses. Rider coming in, a scout called out. Single man carrying a white flag. Moments later, a figure emerged from the storm. The man's uniform bore the colonel's insignia, but was not a United States Army issue. Confederate cavalry, preserved from a war long past. Colonel Theodore Sherman, Mary breathed. I thought he was dead. Should be, Carter added. Court-martialed for selling arms to both sides during the war. Disappeared before they could hang. Him, Hawk's eyes narrowed. The colonel's mentor, the man who taught him everything about running arms. Sherman dismounted carefully, hands visible. Scout Hawk, Colonel Blackwood sends his compliments. That's close enough, Hawk called back. The old Confederate stopped, a thin smile visible beneath his frost-covered mustache. Just delivering a message, Scout, and a choice. I'm listening. The E. Colonel admires your skill. The way you've tracked his men, outmaneuvered his scouts. He's offering you a position. Same deal he offered 5 years ago. Join us. Your cut would be $50,000, enough to buy 10 ranches like yours. And if I refuse, then what happens next will be excessive, even by frontier standards. Sherman's voice hardened. You're good, Scout. Maybe the best, but you're still one man. The colonel has assembled an army. Hawk's response was unexpected. He laughed. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, carrying a certainty that made Sherman step back. One man? Hawk gestured to the darkness around them. Look closer, Colonel Sherman. You're standing in the middle of 20 Army scouts who've had you in their sights for the last 5 minutes. As if on cue, figures emerged from the shadows. Carter's men, positioned with precision. Sherman's face went pale. Impossible. Our scouts checked. Your scouts checked the obvious approaches. Just like you're watching the obvious routes into the pass. Hawk stepped forward. 5 years ago, I was one man with a rifle. Now I'm a scout commander with a company of trained men, and every one of them has waited 5 years to clean this corruption from the army's ranks. You're bluffing. The colonel, The colonel gathered every corrupt officer and gunman in the territory in one place, exactly where I need them. Hawk's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. By noon tomorrow, this ends. Every conspirator, every traitor, every man who chose money over honor, they'll all face justice. Sherman's hand dropped to his gun, but before he could clear leather, 3 rifles pressed against his back. I wouldn't, Carter said quietly. Scout Hawk is offering you the same choice he gave the Blackwoods. Surrender, testify, live, or don't, Hawk finished. Your call, Colonel Sherman, but choose quickly. Dawn's coming and we have work to do. For a long moment, only the storm's voice filled the canyon. Then Sherman's shoulders slumped. You don't know what you're dealing with, Scout. This goes higher than the army. There are senators involved, governors. Good, Hawk cut him off. Write down every name, because when this is over, I'm not just taking down Colonel Blackwood. I'm burning this whole corrupt operation to the ground. As if in response, Shadow's whinny drifted down from the heights, a sound of challenge and triumph. The mayor who had helped set this trap was calling for the final act to begin. Lieutenant Carter stepped forward. Sir, we should move. 2 hours, till dawn. Hawk nodded. Mary, take Sherman and the Blackwoods to the fallback position. Lieutenant, get your men up that trail. I'll deal with the colonel's advanced scouts. How will we know when it's time? Carter asked. A cold smile touched Hawk's lips. Watch the ridgeline. When you see their signal fires go out, you'll know I've begun. As the others melted into the storm, Hawk checked his rifle one final time. The weapon that had made his legend was about to write its final chapter. Some said revenge was a dish best served cold, but justice, real justice, was best served in a Montana blizzard, with a skilled horse, a perfect rifle, and the element of surprise. The colonel was about to learn why they called him Longshot. The storm reached its peak as Hawk moved through. Enemy lines like a ghost. The colonel's men had positioned their signal fires with military precision, each one marking a checkpoint in their defensive network. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd set their watches by garrison time, not mountain time. The changing of the guard would leave a 3-minute gap in their coverage. More than enough time for a man who'd spent decades learning the mountain's secrets. The first signal fire disappeared without a sound, its watchman now bound and gagged in a nearby cave. The second followed 30 seconds later, its guards never, even seeing the shadow that moved through their midst. By the third fire, the pattern was clear to anyone watching, but there was no one left to watch. On the North Ridge, Captain Marcus Reed, formerly of the 7th Cavalry, and now the Colonel's second-in-command, noticed something wrong. The signal fires were going out one by one, but no alarm had been raised. He raised his spyglass, trying to pierce the swirling snow. "Check the western posts," he ordered a lieutenant. "Something's not—" The words died in his throat as he saw the lieutenant's face go pale. Reed turned slowly, already knowing what he'd find. Hawk stood 10 paces away, rifle held casually at his side. Behind him, Shadow emerged from the storm like a spirit, her coat gleaming with frost. "Evening, Captain," Hawk said quietly. "Been a while," Reed's hand twitched toward his holster. "You're surrounded, Scout. 50 men, 47, Hawk corrected. Your western posts are taking an unscheduled nap, and your Gatling guns—" He gestured to where the weapons should have been. "Let's just say they're not going to be much help." "Impossible. Our scouts checked—" "Your scouts checked where a normal man would approach from. But I trained those posts, Captain, designed their defensive layouts myself." Hawk's voice carried no emotion. 5 years ago, when the colonel was still an honorable officer, before he started selling more than just rifles." Reed's face hardened. "You don't know anything about that." "I know everything." Hawk reached into his jacket, producing a weathered leather journal. Michael Blackwood's personal ledger. Every transaction, every name, every dollar that passed. Through the Colonel's operation, including your cut, Captain, 20,000 for coordinating shipments through fort security. That's a lie, page 43. Your signature's at the bottom, right under the Colonel's. The same signature that's on requisition forms for weapons that disappeared from the armory. Weapons that ended up in the raiders' hands. Reed's composure cracked. The Colonel said you died with that ledger. Michael burned it before you shot him. Michael tried to burn it, but he was young, afraid, made mistakes. Hawk's eyes never left Reed's face. Like trusting his uncle when the Colonel promised no one would get hurt. Just business, he said. Just making money from a war that was already happening. You have no proof. I have every proof. Names, dates, bank drafts. Enough to hang every man in this pass. Hawk's voice softened slightly. But that's not why I'm here, Marcus. The use of his first name made Reed flinch. Then why? Because of Sarah. The name hit Reed like a physical blow. You don't get to speak her name. Not after... After what? After I wrote to her telling her how her husband died. How did the Colonel's operation got her brother killed in a raid he helped supply? Hawk took a step forward. She deserved the truth, Marcus. Just like these men deserve to know what they're really fighting for. Reed's hands were shaking now. The Colonel will kill you for this. No. Hawk's certainty was absolute. The Colonel's already finished. Right now, Army scouts are moving into position above his camp. By dawn, every corrupt officer and gunman in this pass will face justice. He paused, letting the words sink in. The only question is whether you'll face that justice with honor or die protecting a man who betrayed everything you once stood for. For a long moment, only the storm's voice filled the silence. Then Reed's shoulders slumped. She never forgave me, did she? No, but she asked me to give you a chance. Same chance I gave Michael. Surrender, testify, live. Reed looked out over the pass where the Colonel's men waited, unaware that their defensive line had been breached. What do you need to know? Everything. Starting with where the Colonel keeps his papers, the real records, not just the ledger. His saddlebags. Never lets them out of his sight. There's a false bottom, documents that would bring down half the territorial government. And the men in the past? How many will fight when they learn the truth? Most are just hired guns. Show them proof the Colonel's operation is finished. They'll stand down. Reed's voice hardened. But his personal guard, 10 men who served with him in the war, they're true believers. They'll die before surrendering. Then they'll die. Hawk's tone was matter-of-fact, but that's their choice, not mine. A whistle cut through the storm, 3 sharp notes that carried clear meaning to any army man. The scouts were in position. Time to decide, Marcus, Hawk said quietly. Sarah's watching this trial. The verdict's already decided, but your testimony could help make sure no other wives lose husbands to corrupt officers' greed. Reed looked at his gun, then at the ledger that held proof of his crimes. Finally, he drew his revolver, not to fire, but to offer it grip first to Hawk. I was a good officer once, he said softly. Before the Colonel convinced me that honor had a price. Honor always has a price, Hawk replied, taking the gun. The mistake is thinking it can be measured in dollars. As if in response, more signal fires began going out across the pass. The storm's voice rose to a howl, carrying with it the sound of men moving into position. The trap meant for one man was about to become a snare for an entire conspiracy. Shadow nickered softly, pressing her nose against Hawk's shoulder. The mare seemed to sense what was coming, the end of 5 years of waiting, the final reckoning for crimes that had stained the army's honor. Get your men to stand down, Hawk ordered. Reed, no need for them to die for the Colonel's sins. And the Colonel? He'll face the same choice Michael did, the same choice you just made. Hawk checked his rifle, but something tells me he won't choose as wisely. Reed nodded slowly. You know he'll try to kill you. Even if every other man surrenders, he'll still come for you himself. I'm counting on it, Hawk's voice carried no emotion. 5 years ago, I gave him a chance to face justice honorably. He chose to sacrifice his own nephew instead. Now he's out of choices, and I'm out of mercy. The storm seemed to gather, itself, as if nature itself was preparing for the coming confrontation. In the distance, horses whinnied nervously, sensing the tension in the air. And above it all, Shadow stood like a sentinel, her coat gathering snow, watching as her master prepared to end what had begun 5 years ago with a young lieutenant's betrayal and a corrupt colonel's greed. The legend of Longshot was about to write its final chapter, and this time there would be no escape for those who had turned their backs on honor for profit. The dawn was coming, and with it, justice would ride into Broken Skull Pass on wings of steel and lead. Captain Reed led Hawk to his command tent, where maps of the pass covered a makeshift table. Markers showed the colonel's forces in precise military detail, a testament to Reed's West Point training. He's changed the deployment since yesterday, Reed explained, moving markers. After Sherman didn't return, the colonel pulled his forces tighter, consolidated around his command post here. His finger tapped a sheltered ravine. Smart. Hawk studied the positions. Harder to flank, better fields of fire. He's expecting a frontal assault at dawn. Because that's what you'd have done 5 years ago. Reed's voice carried reluctant admiration. The colonel's fighting a memory, the scout who'd take impossible shots, challenge his enemies head-on. Tell me about his personal guard. Reed rearranged the markers. 10 men, all former officers. Major Harrison leads them. You remember him? From the Apache campaigns. Good man once. The colonel saved his career after a failed operation. Now Harrison owes him everything. Reed's face darkened. They all do. Each one was facing court-martial or worse before the colonel intervened. Bought their loyalty with favors. Hawk's voice was cold. Then use that loyalty to deeper corruption. A commotion outside drew their attention. A sergeant burst into the tent, snow-coating his uniform. Sir, rider approaching from the East Ravine, says he's from the colonel's personal staff. Hawk melted into the shadows as Reed stepped out. A lone horseman emerged from the storm, his uniform bearing captain's bars. David, Reed called out, what brings you up here? Captain David Chen, the colonel's aide-de-camp, dismounted stiffly. The colonel sent me to check your positions. Signal fires are out, no reports from western posts. He trailed off, seeing the changed expressions of Reed's men. Their weapons weren't quite pointed at him, but neither were they holstered. Marcus, Chen's hand moved toward his gun. What's going on? It's over, David, Reed said quietly. The colonel's operation, the conspiracy, all of it, time to choose sides. There are no sides, Chen spat. Only loyalty. After everything the colonel did for us, he made us betray our oaths, Reed cut him off. Used our gratitude to turn us into criminals. He gave us opportunities. He gave us blood money. A new voice said. Hawk stepped from the shadows, rifle held casually. Money paid for with dead settlers, burned farms, and broken families. Chen's face went pale. You're dead. The colonel says many things, Hawk replied. Most of them lie, like telling Michael Blackwood that no one would get hurt by his gun-running operation. Michael knew the risks. Did he? Did he know his uncle would sacrifice him to protect the bigger operation? Hawk's voice carried no emotion. Or did he die believing he was serving a cause greater than greed? Chen's composure cracked. You don't understand. The colonel, he has connections, powerful men who'll what? Protect him, like they protected Sherman? Hawk produced the old Confederate colonel's insignia. He's in custody now, David, along with the Blackwood brothers. By dawn, every name in that ledger will face justice. Impossible. Our defenses are already breached. Army scouts control the high ground. Your Gatling guns are disabled. Half your men are captured or standing down. Hawk stepped closer. The only question is, Whether you'll face what's coming with honor, or die protecting a man who betrayed everything the uniform stands for. Chen looked at Reed, seeing the truth in his former comrade's face. His shoulders slumped. The colonel. He has files on all of us, everything we did. We know, Reed said quietly. That's why we're offering you the same choice Hawk gave me. Surrender, testify, live. And if we refuse, then you'll die in this pass. Hawk's voice was matter of fact. But that's your choice, not mine. A long moment passed, filled only with the storm's voice. Then Chen drew his pistol, slowly, carefully, and placed it in the snow. What do you need to know? Everything, Hawk replied, starting with the colonel's exact position and the deployment of his personal guard. As Chen began talking, more signal fires went dark across the pass. Shadow watched from her vantage point, steam rising from her flanks despite the cold. The mare had played her part in bringing them here. Now she would witness the final act. In the distance, Lieutenant Carter's scouts moved like shadows through the storm, systematically dismantling the colonel's defensive network. The trap that had been meant for one man was becoming a noose around the neck of every corrupt officer and gunman in the past. They're not all bad men, Chen said finally, watching the fires go out. Most are just soldiers who lost their way. I know, Hawk replied, checking his rifle. That's why they're getting a chance to find it again. And the colonel? He lost his way long ago. Hawk's voice carried the weight of certainty. When he decided that profit was worth more than honor, worth more than his own nephew's life. The storm gathered strength, as if nature itself was preparing for the coming confrontation. In 2 hours, dawn would break over Broken Skull Pass. But long before the sun rose, justice would find those who had hidden from it for too long. The legend of Long Shot was about to become something more than just a story of impossible shots and perfect aim. It would become a reminder that some debts can only be paid in blood, and some sins can only be cleansed by justice. The hunt was almost over. The real battle was about to begin. Colonel Marcus Blackwood stood in his command tent, studying reports from his dwindling network of outposts. Something was wrong. The signal fires were going out one by one, yet no alarm had been raised, no shots fired. It was as if his men were simply vanishing into the storm. Impossible, he muttered, tracing lines on his map. 20 years of military experience told him his position was secure. 3 layers of defensive positions, interlocking fields of fire, veterans manning every crucial post. Yet the silence from his western perimeter spoke volumes. Major Harrison burst into the tent, snow coating his uniform. "Sir, Chen and Reed have gone dark. No response to signals." The colonel's face hardened. "Hawk!" "Sir, it's his signature. Move." Taking out command positions first, isolating units from each other. He stabbed a finger at the map. He's not just coming for revenge. He's dismantling our entire operation piece by piece. But how? Our scouts checked every approach. "Because we're fighting the wrong man," the colonel cut him off. "We prepared for the legend, the impossible shot who'd challenge us head-on. Instead," he gestured at the silent perimeter, "we're facing the scout who trained half these posts himself, who knows every weakness because he designed their strengths." A messenger appeared at the tent flap. "Sir, riders approaching from the North Ridge. It's Captain Chen, and he's not alone." The colonel grabbed his spyglass. Through the swirling snow, he could make out a group of riders approaching under a white flag. Chen and Reed led them, but it was the figure riding between them that made his blood run cold. "Sherman," he breathed. They got to Sherman. Harrison's hand dropped to his gun. "Sir, if they've turned Sherman, they haven't turned anyone." The colonel's voice was ice. Hawk's offering them choices, the same choice he gave Michael. His face twisted at his nephew's name. "Surrender, testify, live, as if honor could be traded for survival." "Your orders, sir." Get the saddlebags, the real ones, not the decoys. The colonel moved to a hidden chest. Time to show Scout Hawk why some secrets are worth dying for. As Harrison hurried to comply, the colonel opened the chest. Inside lay not weapons or ammunition, but documents, hundreds of pages of contracts, bank drafts, and telegrams, the true scope of an operation that went far beyond mere gun-running. "Sir," Harrison returned with the saddlebags, "Chen's group is nearly here. Tell the men to hold their fire, for now." The colonel began sorting documents with practiced efficiency. Hawk thinks he's found corruption in the army. He learned what real power looks like. Outside, the storm's voice rose to a howl as Chen's group approached the inner perimeter. The colonel emerged from his tent, every inch the commanding officer despite the circumstances. His personal guard formed up behind him, 10 men who'd followed him through darker deeds than this. "Captain Chen," he called out as the riders halted, "I see you've brought guests." Chen's face was a mask of shame. "Sir, save it." The colonel's voice cracked like a whip. "Where's Hawk?" "Right here." The scout seemed to materialize from the storm itself, rifle held casually at his side. Shadow stood nearby, her coat gleaming with frost. "Been a while, Colonel." "Not long enough." Blackwood's hand didn't move toward his gun. "I suppose you're here to arrest me, bring me to justice for poor Michael's death." "Michael was just the beginning," Hawk replied calmly. "A thread that unraveled something much bigger. Isn't that right, Sherman?" The old Confederate stepped forward. "Tell him, Marcus. Tell him what we really built here." "Built?" The colonel laughed harshly. "We created an empire. While men like you worried about honor and oaths, we were securing power." "Real power?" He produced a document from his saddlebags. "You see this? Signed by 2 territorial governors and a Supreme Court justice. Immunity, Scout. Complete legal protection for our entire operation. Your evidence, your ledgers. They're worthless. Unless they're delivered to the right people," Hawk countered. "People who've spent 5 years building cases against every name in that document." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in the colonel's eyes. "What are you talking about? Did you really think I spent 5 years just ranching horses?" Hawk's voice carried no emotion. "Every piece of evidence, every connection, every corrupt deal, it's all been documented, verified, waiting for this moment. You're bluffing." "Tell him, Sherman." The old Confederate nodded grimly. "He's not bluffing, Marcus. While we were building our empire, he was building something stronger, a network of honest men, judges, marshals, newspaper editors, all waiting to expose everything. Impossible. We bought every man you could find," Hawk finished. "But you forgot something, Colonel. Honor isn't always for sale, and some men have waited a long time to prove it." As if on cue, more riders emerged from the storm. Army officers wearing badges that marked them as members of the Judge Advocate General's office, territorial marshals with federal warrants, even a newspaper editor from Chicago, known for exposing corruption in high places. "You see, Colonel," Hawk continued, "Michael's ledger wasn't just about guns and money. It was about connections, names, a web of corruption that reached into every territory west of the Mississippi. And for 5 years, while you thought I was hiding from you, I was really building the trap you just rode into." The colonel's composure cracked. "Harrison, kill them all!" But Major Harrison didn't move. Neither did the rest of the personal guard. They'd seen what their commander hadn't, the dozens of army scouts who'd materialized from the storm, rifles ready. "It's over, Marcus," Sherman said quietly. "The Empire's fallen. The only question is whether you'll fall with it." "Never." The colonel's hand finally moved toward his gun. "You want justice, Hawk? Come take it." What happened next became part of the legend. Before anyone could react, both men had drawn. The colonel with the speed that had made him famous in 2 armies, Hawk with the precision that had built his reputation. 2 shots rang out as one. The colonel's bullet passed through the space where Hawk had been standing. But the scout had moved, a ghost step learned from years of mountain warfare. His own shot struck with surgical precision, splitting the colonel's gun in half without drawing blood. "That was for Michael," Hawk said quietly. "The boy you sentenced to death with your greed. The next shot won't be so merciful." For a long moment only the storm's voice filled the silence. Then slowly the colonel raised his empty hands. "You've won, Scout. The operation, the evidence, it's all yours." A cold smile touched his lips. "But you forgot one thing." "And what's that?" "Some men would rather die than face dishonor." His hand moved like lightning, producing a derringer. From his sleeve, but before he could aim, Shadow reared suddenly between them. The mare's hooves struck with devastating force, sending the hidden weapon flying into the snow. The colonel stared at his empty hands, then at the horse that had once again thwarted him. "Trained her well, didn't you?" "Better than you trained." "Michael," Hawk replied. "He died believing in honor. You'll live knowing you betrayed it." As federal marshals moved in with shackles, the storm began to ease. Dawn was approaching, and with it would come the full reckoning for years of corruption and betrayal. The legend of Longshot had evolved into something more, a reminder that justice might be slow, but it was inevitable. Shadow pressed her nose against Hawk's shoulder, steam rising from her coat. The mare had played her part perfectly, from letting herself be stolen to this final confrontation. Some partnerships, like some legends, went beyond mere training. The colonel watched as his empire crumbled around him, his men surrendering one by one. "You've destroyed everything I built," he said finally. "No," Hawk corrected him. "You destroyed it yourself, the day you decided profit was worth more than honor. Everything since then has just been waiting for the bill to come due." As the sun began to rise over Broken Skull Pass, the full scope of what had happened became clear. Not just the end of a corrupt operation, but the beginning of a cleansing that would reach into every corner of the territories. The legend of Longshot would be remembered not just for impossible shots and perfect aim, but for the patience to build a trap 5 years in the making. Justice, it seemed, was best served cold. In a Montana winter, with a skilled horse, a perfect shot, and the knowledge that some debts can only be paid in full. "Search the tent," Hawk ordered. "Every document, every scrap of paper." The colonel never kept just one copy of anything. Federal marshals moved quickly, their search revealing hidden compartments in the colonel's desk and trunk. Each yielded more evidence: letters from corrupt officials, banking records, detailed maps of army supply routes. "This goes deeper than we thought," Marshal James Wade said, examining a leather-bound ledger. "Treasury Department connections, railroad consortiums, even foreign investors." "The colonel wasn't just running guns," Sherman explained, his voice heavy with shame. "He was building an empire based on controlling transportation and supply lines throughout the territories. The weapons were just the start." Hawk studied a particular document with intense focus. "These shipping manifests, they're coded, but the pattern's clear. They weren't just selling surplus army weapons." "No," Sherman confirmed. "They were selling something far more valuable. Information, army patrol routes, garrison strengths, response times. Everything a raider would need to hit settlements and vanish before help arrived." Major Harrison, now cooperating fully, stepped forward. The colonel called it tactical advantage marketing, selling intelligence to both sides, raiders and settlers alike. Those who paid got protection. Those who didn't became targets, Hawk finished grimly, creating the very threats they were profiting from stopping. Lieutenant Carter appeared at the tent's entrance. "Sir, you need to see this." Outside, the storm had finally begun to ease. In the growing light, a line of wagons was visible at the edge of the camp, but these weren't ordinary supply wagons. They were mobile offices, complete with printing equipment and telegraph machines. "A complete counterfeiting operation," Marshal Wade breathed. They weren't just falsifying military documents, they were printing their own banknotes. Territorial script, Sherman explained. Legal tender backed by nothing but the colonels. Connections. Every settlement was forced to accept it, while real currency was siphoned east to their banking partners. Hawke examined the printing plates with professional interest. This is why you really wanted Michael's ledger back, not just to hide the gun running, but to protect this entire financial operation. The colonel, now securely bound, managed a cold smile. You understand nothing, Scout. This wasn't about mere profit. We were building a new order, one that would have brought stability to the territories. Stability through corruption. Hawke's voice was sharp. Through murder and theft? Through control, Blackwood snapped. While idealists like you chased honor and justice, we were creating a system that worked. Every territory, every official, every transaction, all managed, all profitable, all controlled. All built on blood money, Marshal Wade countered, on dead settlers and burned farms. Acceptable losses in any campaign, the colonel replied smoothly. Even you must understand that, Scout. How many did you kill in the name of army orders? The difference, Hawke said quietly, is that I never pretended my kills were for profit, never sacrificed innocent lives for personal gain. A commotion at the perimeter drew their attention. More riders were approaching, army officers in formal dress uniforms. At their head rode General Howard, commander of the Department of the Northwest. Report, Scout Hawke, the general ordered, dismounting. Operation successfully concluded, sir. Colonel Blackwood and his entire organization are in custody. Evidence secured, including proof of wider conspiracy. The general surveyed the scene, the captured men, the evidence wagons, the printing operation. Well done, though I suspect wider conspiracy is an understatement. Sir, Marshal Wade, step forward. The documentation we've found, it implicates dozens of territorial officials, possibly even members of Congress. I'm aware, Marshal. The general's face was grim. We've had teams standing by in 6 territories waiting for this moment. As we speak, federal agents are executing search warrants from Denver to Seattle. The colonel's entire network is being rolled up. The colonel's composure finally cracked. Impossible. Our sources would have warned us. Your sources, General, Howard cut him off, have been feeding you carefully selected information for months. Every leak, every warning, every piece of intelligence, all designed to lead you here. Understanding dawned in Blackwood's eyes. You used me. Like you used Michael? Hawke asked quietly. The difference is, your nephew died for your greed. Your men will live to face justice. Shadow nickered softly, drawing attention to movement in the pass. More riders were arriving, newspaper reporters, federal prosecutors, even a photographer from Harper's Weekly. The story breaks in every major paper tomorrow, General Howard announced. No backroom deals, no quiet arrangements. The entire operation was exposed to public view. You'll never make it stick, the colonel snarled. Our connections are already turning on each other, Marshal Wade interrupted, holding up a telegraph message. Your banking partners in New York are cooperating with federal investigators. Seems honor isn't the only thing that can be bought, as if to emphasize the point, more prisoners were being led in, corrupt officials and conspirators arrested across 6 territories, all converging on Broken Skull Pass for transport to federal custody. Your empire's fallen, Marcus, Sherman said, quietly, and unlike you, most of your men are choosing survival over loyalty. The colonel looked at his former mentor with contempt. And you? The great Colonel Sherman, betraying everything we built. No, Sherman's voice was heavy with regret. I'm just finally facing what we really built, a temple of corruption that destroyed everything we once claimed to serve. Hawke watched as federal agents began cataloging the evidence. 5 years of patience, of building networks and gathering proof, had finally paid off. But the cost had been high. in lives, in trust, in the very honor they'd fought to restore. Shadow pressed against his shoulder, seemingly understanding his thoughts. The mare had been more than just bait in this operation. She'd been a symbol of the patience and trust needed to bring down an empire built on lies. "What happens now?" Lieutenant Carter asked, watching the prisoners being loaded for transport. "Justice," Hawk replied simply. "Real justice, not the kind that can be bought or sold." As the sun rose fully over Broken Skull Pass, its light revealed not just the end of a corrupt empire, but the beginning of a cleansing that would reach into every corner of the territories. The legend of Longshot would be remembered not just for perfect aim and impossible shots, but for the patience to build a trap 5 years in the making. Some debts, it seemed, required more than just a quick draw to settle. They required time, patience, and the understanding that true justice was worth the wait. The storm had passed, but its effects would be felt for years to come. The morning after the arrests at Broken Skull Pass dawned clear and cold. Hawk sat in the telegraph office in Hamilton, watching as operator Sarah Cooper's fingers flew across the key, sending reports of the colonel's operation to newspapers across the country. Each message carried another piece of the conspiracy into the light, but something wasn't right. The replies coming back carried an undertone of tension that made the hairs on his neck stand up. "Third message from Chicago," Sarah reported, her face grim. "Their federal prosecutor was found dead in his office, made to look like suicide." Marshal Wade cursed softly. "They're cleaning the house. Anyone who might testify is a target." Hawk finished. He turned to Lieutenant Carter. "Where are the prisoners?" 2 days out, headed for Fort Benton. 4 wagons, heavy escort. Not heavy enough. Hawk stood, checking his rifle. "The colonel's partners won't let them reach trial. Too many secrets at stake." As if confirming his words, the telegraph key clattered again. Sarah's hands shook as she decoded the message. Attack on the Denver courthouse. 3 judges were murdered. Their files on the railroad conspiracy were stolen. "It's starting," Marshal Wade said quietly. "The colonel's partners are cutting their losses. Anyone who knows too much becomes a liability." More messages arrived in quick succession. A bank president in San Francisco was found dead. A newspaper editor's office burned in Seattle. A federal investigator's family was kidnapped in Salt Lake City. "They're not just cleaning the house," Carter realized. "They're sending a message. Cross us, expose us, and everything you love becomes a target." Shadow nickered outside, drawing their attention. The mare's ears were pricked toward the north, her posture alert. Hawk had learned to trust her instincts. "Rider coming?" he said, moving to the window. Through his scope, he caught glimpses of a horse being pushed to its limits. Its rider slumped. In the saddle, the rider nearly fell dismounting outside the telegraph office. It was one of Carter's scouts, his uniform stained with blood. "Ambush!" he gasped as they helped him inside. 10 miles north, professional hit team, at least 20 men. They took the colonel." "Casualties?" Carter demanded. 3 dead. Rest, wounded. They knew exactly where to hit us, like they had inside information. Hawk's eyes narrowed. Not inside information, military precision. These weren't just hired guns. "Black operations," Marshal Wade nodded grimly. "Army's own shadow warriors, men trained to disappear without leaving traces." "The colonel had more friends than we thought," Carter said. "Question is, what do we do now?" Hawk checked his ammunition. "We hunt them." "Against Black Ops teams. That's suicide." "No." Hawk's voice carried quiet certainty. "That's justice. The colonel's partners think they can bury their secrets in blood. Time they learned why some legends don't die easily." Sarah produced a worn map of the territory. "The old Morrison Trail leads north from the ambush site, cuts through Shadow Valley before reaching the Canadian border." "Shadow Valley," Wade mused. "Perfect terrain for an ambush or a counter-ambush." "They'll expect us to follow standard pursuit procedure," Carter added. "Split into teams, cover multiple routes." Then we don't. Hawk traced a line on the map. We go in force, but not where they expect. Sarah, send messages to every marshal and honest lawman within 2 days' ride. Tell them to converge on Shadow Valley. They'll see us coming, Wade warned. Good. Hawk's smile was cold, because we're not just going after the colonel. We're going to draw out every shadow warrior, every corrupt officer, every killer they send. Make them commit their forces where we choose. That's not pursuit. Carter realized. That's hunting. The colonel's partners want to play shadow games. Hawk checked his rifle's scope. Let's show them what real shadows can do. The scout who'd brought the news looked up from where they'd bandaged his wounds. Sir, these men, they're ghosts, professional killers with military training. So am I. Hawk's voice carried no emotion. Difference is, I've spent 5 years learning every trail, every hiding spot, every ambush point in these mountains. They're playing on my hunting grounds now. Shadow Valley lived up to its name, a deep gash in the mountains where perpetual mist clung to the rocks, creating natural curtains of concealment. Perfect territory for men who dealt in death and secrets. But as Hawk led his growing force north, the valley's shadows seemed to whisper with movement. Word had spread fast. Marshals and lawmen were converging from across the territory, each bringing their own scores to settle with the colonel's organization. Like calling wolves to a hunt, Wade observed, watching more riders join their column. Every honest badge for 100 miles, coming to finish what we started. More than badges, Hawk replied. He'd recognized faces in the gathering force, scouts he'd served with, settlers who'd lost family to raiders, even a few reformed. Outlaws seeking redemption. They're coming because some fights are worth dying for. Shadow pressed close to his side as they made camp that night, the mare's senses alert for danger. Around them, over 50 men prepared for what morning would bring. Not just a pursuit, but a reckoning. The colonel's rescue was too well coordinated. Carter reported, studying maps by firelight. They had men and resources pre-positioned. This was planned. Of course it was, Marshal Wade agreed. They knew we'd eventually catch him. Probably had escape plans in place for months. Then they also know we're coming, one of the deputies said. Might even be watching us now. They're watching, Hawk confirmed, just not as well as they think. He produced detailed sketches of the valley. While they've been playing their shadow games, I've spent 5 years mapping every cave, every hidden trail, every natural fortress in these mountains. The maps revealed a complex network of intersecting paths and positions, knowledge bought with years of patient observation. The colonel's men will take him to the old mining complex here, Hawk indicated, at a spot deep in the valley. Defensible position, multiple escape routes, exactly where I'd go if I was running their operation. How can you be sure? Because I helped design their procedures. Hawk's voice carried no pride, only certainty. Before Michael died, before I learned what the colonel really was, I trained half their scout teams myself, taught them everything they know about mountain warfare. But not everything you know, Carter realized. No. Hawk checked his rifle one final time. They learned what I taught them, but I've spent 5 years learning new tricks. Tomorrow they'll understand why some legends grow stronger with time. As if in response, Shadow's ears pricked toward the valley. Something was moving in the darkness. Shapes that might have been shadows, might have been men. They're probing our positions, Wade observed. Testing our defenses. Let them look, Hawk replied. Let them think they know what's coming. Tomorrow they'll learn the difference between soldiers playing at being shadows and a man who's made the darkness his home. Around the camp, men checked weapons and shared quiet words of preparation. They knew what morning would bring, not just a fight, but a cleansing, a chance to prove that some things were worth more than money or power. The legend of Longshot was about to evolve again. Not just a story of perfect aim and patience, but a reminder that justice sometimes needed teeth to reach into the shadows where corruption hid. Dawn was coming, and with it a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of power in the territories. The Colonel's partners were about to learn why some legends refused to die, because some debts could only be paid in shadow and blood. A commotion at the edge of camp drew their attention. 2 more riders approached, their horses lathered despite the cold. Hawk recognized them immediately, Army intelligence officers he'd worked with during the Apache campaigns. "Major Phillips," he nodded as they dismounted. "Been a while. Wish it was under better circumstances," Phillips replied grimly. "We've identified the hit team that took the Colonel, Black Shield Unit." The name sent a murmur through the gathered men. Black Shield was more than just another Army Special Operations unit. They were the government's own ghosts, used for missions that officially never happened. "That's impossible," Carter protested. "Black Shield was disbanded after the war." "Officially, yes," Phillips confirmed. "Unofficially, they've been operating as private contractors, taking jobs from whoever can afford their services in silence." Wade cursed softly. "How many?" 24 operators, split into 6-man teams, all former special operations, all with extensive mountain warfare experience. Phillips produced a series of photographs. Led by this man, Colonel Marcus Kane. Hawk studied the image. The face was unfamiliar, but the eyes, he recognized that cold calculation. Kane was Black Shield's commander during the war, Phillips explained. When they were disbanded, he took the best operators and went private. They've been selling their services to the highest bidders ever since, including the Colonel's organization, Hawk concluded. More than that, Kane's men have been their primary enforcement arm. Whenever someone threatened to expose the operation, Black Shield made them disappear. No evidence, no witnesses, just gone. Sarah, who'd been monitoring the telegraph, approached with fresh messages. Reports coming in from across the territories. Black Shield teams hitting targets simultaneously. Witnesses, evidence lockups, anyone who might testify. They're not just rescuing the Colonel, Carter realized. They're burning the entire operation to the ground, eliminating every trace. Not just traces, Wade added. They're eliminating hope, showing what happens to anyone who stands against them. Hawk absorbed this information, his mind working through implications. Kane's smart. He'll expect us to split up and try to protect potential targets, spread ourselves thin. That's standard procedure, Phillips agreed. Divide our forces, protect key witnesses. Then we do the opposite. Hawk's voice carried absolute certainty. We gather every badge, every gun, every man willing to fight. Bring them all here to Shadow Valley. That's insane, one of the deputies protested. We'd be abandoning everyone else to Black Shield. No, Marshal Wade's eyes lit with understanding. We'd be forcing Kane to commit his forces, make him choose between completing his other missions and protecting the Colonel. He'll have to concentrate on his teams here, Carter added. The Colonel's too valuable to risk losing. Exactly. Hawk traced lines on the map. Instead of chasing shadows across 6 territories, we make them come to us. Fight on ground we choose, under conditions we control. Phillips studied the valley's layout. Kane's good. He'll recognize a trap. Counting on it. Hawk's smile was cold. Because he'll think he knows how to counter it. These men are used to being the hunters, the ghosts no one can touch. They learned what it means to be hunted. Shadow nickered softly, drawing their attention to movement in the darkness. More riders were arriving, a steady stream of reinforcements drawn by word of what was coming. They're not just lawmen, Sarah observed. Look at their faces. She was right. Among the new arrivals, Hawk recognized men and women whose lives had been touched by the Colonel's operation, settlers who'd lost homes to raiders, merchants ruined by rigged contracts, families destroyed by corruption that went unpunished. Kane's men fight for money, Wade said quietly. These people are fighting for justice. More than that, Hawk replied. They're fighting to prove that shadows don't always belong to the corrupt, that some legends grow stronger in darkness. As night deepened, the camp transformed. What had started as a pursuit force was becoming an army of justice. Men and women preparing to stand against killers who'd operated with impunity for too long. Mary Blackfeather appeared like a spirit from the shadows, her medicine bag at her side. The spirits are restless tonight, she reported. They sense blood coming. The Colonel's partners thought they could bury their secrets. Hawk checked his rifle's action. Time they learned that some secrets refuse to stay buried. Kane's men will come soon, Phillips warned. They'll try to probe our defenses, test our positions. Let them come. Hawk's voice carried no doubt. Let them think they're the only ones who know how to move in darkness. Tomorrow, they'll learn why the Blackfeet called me Shadow Walker long before I became Longshot. Around the camp, preparations continued. Men shared ammunition and stories, each adding their own reason for being there to the growing legend. This wasn't just about catching escaped prisoners anymore. It had become something more, a stand against corruption that had festered too long in high places. The legend of Longshot was about to become part of something larger, not just a story of perfect shots and patience, but a reminder that justice sometimes needed to rise from the shadows where power hid its darkest secrets. Dawn was coming, and with it, a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of corruption in the territories. Black Shield was about to learn why some legends refused to die quietly, because in Shadow Valley, even ghosts could bleed. Dawn painted Shadow Valley in shades of grey and mist as Hawk positioned his forces. The old mining complex loomed ahead, its abandoned buildings perfect cover for Kane's operators. But something in the morning stillness made his instincts scream, warning. Too quiet, Marshal Wade murmured beside him. No movement, no guards visible. Because they're already moving, Hawk replied, studying the scene through his scope. Kane's men don't play defense, they're positioning for their own attack. As if confirming his words, Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward. The mare's muscles tensed, sensing what human eyes couldn't yet see. They're coming, Mary Blackfeather whispered from her position among the rocks. Moving like spirits through the mist. Lieutenant Carter's voice crackled over the makeshift field telephone network they'd established. Movement on the North Ridge, at least 2 teams using Army hand signals. Let them come. Hawk's voice carried quiet certainty. Everything's positioned, just as you planned, Wade confirmed. Every approach covered, every escape route watched. If they're in the valley, they're committed. The first shot came from an impossible angle. A Black Shield sniper trying to draw their fire. The bullet whined harmlessly overhead, but its message was clear. The ghosts were ready to dance. Hawk's response was a single shot that split the sniper's rifle scope without touching the man behind it. A warning returned in kind. Impressive, a new voice called from the mist. Colonel Kane emerged like a shadow taking form, his Black Shield uniform bearing no insignia or rank. The stories about your aim weren't exaggerated, Scout Hawk. Neither were the stories about your arrogance, Colonel Kane. Hawk's rifle remained steady. Bringing your men into a valley with one exit? That's not like you. Who said there's only one exit? Kane's smile was cold. My men have been preparing this ground for days. We have routes you haven't even dreamed of. You mean like the old mining tunnels? The vertical shaft behind the processing plant? Or maybe the underwater cave system your demolition team tried to open last night? For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Kane's eyes. How did you... Because I've spent 5 years mapping every inch of this valley. While you were playing soldier for hire, I was learning its secrets. Hawk's voice carried no emotion. Your men are good, Kane, but they're fighting on my hunting grounds now. As if on cue, explosions rumbled through the valley. Not attack charges, but controlled detonations that sealed Kane's secret escape routes one by one. Impossible, Kane breathed. Our preparations were perfect. No one could have... You prepared for a legend, Hawk cut him off. For the scout, who made impossible shots. But you forgot something crucial. I stopped being just a shooter 5 years ago. More explosions echoed as Kane's carefully planned retreat routes disappeared. His hand dropped to his gun, but Shadow's sudden whinny froze him in place. The mayor's warning carried through the mist, followed by the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked, dozens of them, from every direction. Your men are surrounded, Hawk continued calmly, not just by lawmen, but by every person your organization has wronged, settlers you terrorized, families you destroyed, good men and women who've waited years for this moment. Kane's composure cracked slightly. You think these civilians can stand against Black Shield operators? I think they already have. Hawk nodded toward the ridgeline where Kane's snipers had been positioned. One by one, Black Shield operators were emerging, hands raised, covered by Carter's scouts. Your men are professionals, Kane. They know when a position is untenable. Bede, Colonel, is already in custody again. Marshal Wade stepped from the mist, rifle ready. Your rescue operation failed before it began. The man you broke out with was a double wearing his uniform. The real colonel never left federal custody. Kane's face twisted with rage. You played us! Like you played with people's lives? Hawk's voice hardened. How many innocent people did your teams eliminate to protect the colonel's operation? How many families were destroyed to keep secrets? We were soldiers, Kane snarled. Following orders, serving a greater... You were murderers, Hawk cut him off, hiding behind military precision to mask simple greed. But today, that ends. More figures emerged from the mist, not just lawmen and settlers, but Kane's own operators. Black Shield teams laying down their weapons, choosing survival over futile resistance. Your men are surrendering, Kane, Wade announced. Time to make your choice. Kane's hand moved with snake-like speed, drawing a hidden derringer. But before he could aim, 3 shots rang out as one. The first, from Hawk's rifle, split Kane's gun in half. The second, from Wade's position, knocked him off his feet. The third, from Mary's concealment, ensured he wouldn't rise again. As Kane lay in the mud, clutching his wounded shoulder, Hawk approached carefully. That was for Michael, he said quietly, and for every other life, your organization is destroyed. The mist began to clear as federal marshals moved in, securing prisoners and collecting weapons. What had started as a simple pursuit had become something more, a cleansing of shadows that had haunted the territories for too long. Shadow pressed against Hawk's shoulder, steam rising from her coat in the cold morning air. The mayor who had helped set this trap in motion seemed to understand the significance of what had happened. It's really over, Carter asked, watching Black Shield operators being led away. This part is, Hawk replied, but there's more work to do. The colonel's operation reached into every territory, every level of government. This is just the beginning. Marshal, Wade nodded grimly. The Shadow War's won. Now comes the harder part, cleaning up what the shadows were hiding. As if in response, more riders appeared on the valley rim. Not soldiers or lawmen this time, but ordinary citizens, settlers, merchants, families, people who had lived under the shadow of corruption for too long. They had come not to fight, but to witness justice finally being served. They'll try to bury this, Mary warned. Powerful men will want to hide their connections. Let them try. Hawk checked his rifle one final time. Some stories refuse to. Stay buried. Some legends grow stronger in daylight than shadow. The sun broke through finally, revealing the full scope of what had happened in Shadow Valley. Not just the end of Black Shield, but the beginning of a cleansing that would reach into every corner of the territories. Kane watched from where he lay bound as his carefully built world crumbled. You've destroyed everything, he said finally. No, Hawk corrected him. We've just reminded people that justice isn't about perfect shots or military precision. It's about standing against darkness, no matter how deep the shadows run. As federal agents began processing prisoners and collecting evidence, Hawk mounted Shadow. The mayor seemed to understand that their work here was done. "Where will you go?" Wade asked. "Wherever the next shadow needs light," Hawk replied. "The Colonel's partners will try to rebuild, try to hide their corruption in new darkness, and you'll be waiting." "No." Hawk's smile was quiet. "I'll be hunting. Because some legends don't just wait in the shadows, they bring the dawn." The legend of Longshot had evolved one final time. Not just a story of perfect aim and patience, but a reminder that justice sometimes needed more than just a steady hand. It needed the courage to stand against corruption, the wisdom to build better than what was torn down, and the understanding that some fights were worth any cost. As Hawk rode out of Shadow Valley, hundreds of witnesses watched him go. They would tell this story in years to come, not just of shots that never missed, but of a man who proved that legends could serve justice instead of power. Some said Shadow Valley changed that day, that something in its mists and secrets was cleansed by what happened, that even now corrupt men hesitate to enter its bounds, remembering how shadows once turned against those who thought they owned the darkness. But in frontier towns and territories across the West, they tell a different story. They say that somewhere out there, a scout still rides with his black mare, watching for shadows that need light, that when corruption thinks itself safe in darkness, a legend might still be hunting, because some debts can only be paid in full, and some legends never truly end. They just wait for the next dawn to rise. 1 month after Shadow Valley, Nathan Hawke stood in Governor Morrison's office in Helena, watching as federal agents carried out boxes of evidence. The investigation had spread like wildfire, consuming corrupt officials at every level of territorial government. "Final count?" he asked Marshal Wade, who was supervising the operation. 37 territorial officials indicted, Wade reported, checking his notebook. 12 judges, 5 bank presidents, 3 railroad executives. The colonel's operation went deeper than anyone imagined. Mary Blackfeather appeared in the doorway, more documents in hand. "Found these in a hidden safe. Banking records showing payments to senators in Washington." "The ripples keep spreading," Wade observed. "Every piece of evidence leads to 3 more conspirators." Hawke studied a particular document with intense focus. It was a map showing planned railroad expansions through Indian territories, routes that would have displaced thousands for corporate profit. "They weren't just stealing money," he said quietly. "They were stealing futures, reshaping the entire territory to serve their greed." Lieutenant Carter entered, his uniform now bearing Captain's bars, a promotion earned in Shadow Valley. "Sir, you need to see this." In the street below, a crowd had gathered, not angry protesters or curious onlookers, but ordinary citizens, settlers, merchants, tribal members, people whose lives had been touched by the colonel's operation. They stood in silent witness as corruption was dragged into daylight. "They're not just watching," Mary observed. "They're learning that shadows can be fought, that justice can reach into high places." Shadow nickered from her position near the building's entrance, drawing their attention to new arrivals. A group of army officers led by General Howard approached, their expressions grim. "The military investigation is complete," the general announced once they'd gathered in the governor's office. 23 officers court-martialed, 15 more under investigation. The corruption went right to the War Department. "And Kane's organization?" Hawke asked. "Black Shield is finished. Their remaining operators are either in custody or have turned in evidence. But," the general hesitated, "we found something in their records, something that changes everything we thought. We knew." He produced a leather-bound journal, not the colonel's ledger, but something older. Its pages contained mission reports dating back to the Civil War. Black Shield wasn't just a military unit that went private, Howard explained. They were a part of something larger, a shadow organization within the government itself, using war and corruption to reshape territories for private interests. Wade whistled softly. How high does it go? All the way to Washington. Cabinet members, senators, industrial barons, all part of a plan to control the West's development through corruption and violence. Hawke absorbed this information, his mind working through implications. That's why they fought so hard to protect the colonel's operation. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. And now, Carter asked, now we keep pulling threads, Marshal Wade replied. Every piece of evidence, every corrupt official, every dark secret, all of it comes to light. Sarah Cooper arrived. From the telegraph office, fresh messages in hand. Wire from Washington. The Senate's convening a special investigation. Newspapers are running the story nationwide. They'll try to bury it, Mary warned. Powerful men don't give up control easily. Let them try. Hawke's voice carried quiet certainty. The shadows are broken now. Light's getting in. As if to emphasize his point, sunlight broke through Helena's perpetual spring clouds, illuminating the crowd below. More people were arriving, not just from the city, but from surrounding territories. Each carried their own story of how corruption had touched their lives. What happens now? Carter asked, watching the gathering below. Now? Hawke checked his rifle out of habit. Now we build something better. Not just taking down corruption, but creating systems that serve justice instead of power. General Howard nodded approvingly. The Army's already implementing new oversight measures. No more secret units, no more shadow operations. And the territories? Wade asked. They'll need watching, Hawke replied. Power always tries to hide, in shadows. But now people know the shadows can be fought. Shadow pressed against his shoulder, steam rising from her coat in the morning air. The mayor, who had helped bring down an empire, seemed to understand that their work wasn't finished. It had just changed form. The legend will be different now, Mary observed, not just about perfect shots and patient hunting. Good, Hawke said quietly, because that's not what was needed most. What people needed was hope, proof that justice could reach anywhere, touch anyone no matter how powerful. As federal agents continued their work, more riders arrived in Helena. Army scouts who had fought at Shadow Valley, marshals who had helped expose the conspiracy, common citizens ready to testify about corruption. They had witnessed. They're not just here to watch, Wade realized. They're here to help build what comes next. Hawke mounted Shadow, surveying the growing crowd. What had started as a simple pursuit of stolen horses had become something larger, a reminder that legends could serve greater purposes than just their own stories. Where will you go? Carter asked. Wherever shadows need light, Hawke replied. The colonel's partners had operations in every territory. Each one needs to be found, exposed, destroyed. Sounds like a big job for one man, Wade observed. Who said anything about one man? Hawke gestured to the crowd below. Look around. Every person here is part of the legend now. Every one of them knows shadows can be fought. The sun climbed higher over Helena as federal wagons carried away, the evidence of decades of corruption. But something more important was rising, a new understanding that justice wasn't just about law books and badges. It was about ordinary people standing against darkness, no matter how deep it ran. The legend of Longshot had completed its final evolution, not just a story of perfect aim and patient hunting, but a reminder that some fights belong to everyone, that when people stood together, even the deepest shadows could be broken. They say that in the years that followed, corruption learned to fear more than just a scout with perfect aim. It learned to fear the light itself and the people who had learned to bring it into dark places, because some legends don't belong to one person. They belong to everyone who chooses to stand against shadows, and in the territories they still tell stories of how justice rode with dawn's light into Shadow Valley and emerged with something more powerful than any bullet: Hope that darkness could always be fought, no matter how deep it ran. The legend had done its work. Now it belonged to those who would carry its light forward. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.